It's amazing to have the opportunity to listen to all three of you. Juana Mihescu is my name. I work with retail agglomerations and cities in Sweden. And my question is to Professor Glaser, to all of you, but maybe to Professor Glaser most. You know that Sweden, we know that Sweden has large rural areas and that they are dying out. So there's massive flow from the rural areas to the cities. And there is, in the same time, a massive effort from the Swedish government to support these rural areas. There is a lot of research on how to revitalize these rural areas so that we don't let them die. So my question is this useless? Should we let them die?
No, they shouldn't die. They should shrink to greatness, I think, is the right view. And the key here is that I think it's certainly the sort of starting economic logic, and I think it's a very powerful one. Is that there's no innate social interest in having people live in any particular place versus another, right? There's no reason that we, Americans should try and make sure that more people populate the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. I mean, that would be a mad thing to do. And just because people lived in a place in the past doesn't mean that they should continue to live in the place in the future, right? Conditions change. And as a result, I think the right national policy continues to be spatial neutrality, allowing these places to shrink. Now, there's an important caveat with that, an important sidebar with that, which is, while I don't particularly believe in trying to encourage people to live in particularly cold or desolate areas, we care about children growing up everywhere, and we care about humanity everywhere. And the job of the government is to make sure, and I think, Fred did a great job on this, to sort of highlighting this, that we need a robust public sector that makes sure that the kids growing up in these areas are well educated, whether or not they stay in these areas or not, that they have decent health care, that the public services are there and are robust. But there's no reason why they need to live in the same halls as their fathers. I mean, in the U.S. context, just once I want to hear a mayor say, "Yeah, my city lost 200,000 people during my term, but I educated my kids fantastically, and they went and got great jobs in Atlanta." And because that's what it's all about. It's fundamentally about helping poor people, whether or not they live in poor places or not. Do you want to?
I don't want to add anything on that point.
Yeah.
Well, you see, the question. Okay. The question is essentially whether the distinction between rural and urban makes much sense at this moment. I come from a country where officially we have abandoned the whole distinction between urban and rural. If the distinction is only based on the density of population, and if all other things are identical, people with the same type of education, the same access to many facilities, of course I'm in a small country, that makes a difference, but if that is the case, and if the only difference is that you are living in an area with a lower population density than in urban areas or so, what is the sense of making that type of difference? So we have given it up. We don't talk about urban and rural areas anymore as a meaningful distinction for policy. It doesn't exist anymore. Because it's the same type of people. Nowadays, everyone has the same access to most of the facilities. In Western Europe, certainly not over the whole world. That is absolutely true.
Just as Peter's raised the Western Europe context, if we're thinking globally, of course, the observation that the majority of the global population now lives in urban settlements is either very, very interesting or very, very banal as an observation. And of course, the other side of that is that nearly half of the world's population lives in non-urban settlements. Not in Sweden, perhaps not elsewhere in Western Europe, but certainly in Africa and in India, most of the population are still living outside of urban centres. And so if we think beyond the local, then clearly support for rural environments and rural settlements is a very crucial part of any kind of government policy towards towards human settlements more generally.
We have time for one or two more questions. Oh, there. Okay.
I'm Zainab Tagildiem. I'm a researcher at the Urban Regional Study. I would like to hear your comments about what we hear about this due to economic crisis. Many people many Greek people moving back into rural area actually to seeking cheaper lifestyle due to debt, unemployment, etc. Is it going to be a trend, or what's the, I mean, since economic crisis is not, it's not solved yet, and you are expecting to go more into this kind of crisis in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab.
Well, you see, of course, in any economic recession, the economic heartlands normally are first hit, and later on the peripheral and rural areas, so they're always lagging behind. And of course, sometimes the recession might last a little bit longer, but the same holds also for important economic sectors like the construction sector, always first hit, and then all the other sectors might follow. But at the same time, it may have important implications. And over the past years, I have studied extensively the Greek economy. In fact, in this respect, I also would have a question to my friend Ed. But let me first try to indicate what we have found. If there is a persistent decline in welfare in areas compared to other areas, and that is what we have seen in Greece, what you will see is at the same time a rapid rise of right-wing political parties. And the Greek neo-Nazi party, which is gaining a lot of popularity nowadays, can easily be explained by looking into the pattern of economic development in many of the regions in Greece, which I find worrying from many aspects. But that's an important element. And that brings me to a question I also have to add. Because you were talking about happiness. Now, happiness, of course, you can have self-reported happiness and objective happiness, and there's a lot of research in sociology. But could you indicate whether there is a relationship between economic development in regions and cities depending on the level of happiness, whether self-reported or objectively measured happiness? Because this has to do with cultural economics, which has become a very fashionable discipline nowadays. And there was one.
So it's the relationship.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Yeah, whether happiness or people or regions which have a higher level of happiness are more productive, are earning more, or whether the relationship is just the opposite.
Sure. So it depends upon where you look, the happiness income relationship. So in the U.S., it's actually relatively flat. It's as in some sense that was taken early on as being some evidence for the existence of a spatial equilibrium. That in fact, you weren't moving to a high income place didn't necessarily meant that you were getting a free lunch. You were paying for that with higher housing prices and sometimes with negative amenities as well. In the developing world, India and China, very strong, robust, positive relationships between happiness and income, which suggests maybe that we're not at a spatial equilibrium in these places. So they're the areas that are wealthier, do have people who typically say that they're happier. What is the causality? We have. I think there are ways in which we could try and do that. You look at industrial shocks and happiness. I think when I looked at that in the U.S. data, since the overall relationship is zero, you didn't get very much by trying to push back towards higher causality. I don't have, at this point in time, good instruments for income levels across Chinese cities. So it's something that's surely worth doing. I will say just on the Greek question, so the U.S., this was certainly not the U.S. experience in terms of the Great Recession. The geography of the U.S. Great Recession was very clear, and it was actually associated above all in terms of mobility with a rapid shutdown in mobility. So actually, as opposed to many of our previous recessions, the people sheltered in place, if you were. In part, this is exacerbated by the fact that homeowners had lost their equity in their house and so weren't able to move out. It was also for younger people, they weren't forming new households, right? So credit was hard. It wasn't easy to move and to buy a new place. But you had very limited mobility, and in terms of the overall, the worst parts of the recession were flow Maika, Florida, Michigan, and California. And they tended to be inland areas in California, so the lower human capital areas of California, not the coastal cities. Michigan was also a disaster, and Florida was as well. Typically, the places that were often hit by the most extreme swings in the housing bubbles. And of course, just as in the case of education being predictive of the upside, education was also very predictive of protection against the downside. So, enormously strong correlations between unemployment and a lack and education, meaning that more educated places had much less unemployment than less educated places.
Let me say something about Greece and then something about happiness. And of course, it's going to vary from national and urban context to context. But where you do see that movement out of the cities in response to economic or financial crisis, presumably it's always going to be accompanied, or often going to be accompanied, as it was in Greece, by state withdrawal. So if you're no longer accessing services, resources, opportunities through markets, as was the case in the Greek economy, then clearly one option is to move to cheaper areas of housing where there is more family support, potentially, where there are other ways of provisioning your needs and wants other than directly through markets. But of course, where the state is not compensating in terms of social services, social safety net and social provision, then that's going to be another factor that is going to push people out of those areas which otherwise would be sites of collective consumption and collective provision. On happiness, I would just say, as a sociologist, I don't believe in happiness. I don't think, as a person, as a human being, I believe in happiness. I don't believe it's something that, I don't believe it's a proper object of social scientific analysis, and I certainly don't think it's anything that can be engineered through policy or other means. And this comes back to a point at which Ed was making in his presentation. I do believe that things like health outcomes and education outcomes and standards of housing and environmental standards are much better measures of human well-being than self-reported indices of happiness. So in a sense, I'm a bit of a perverse sociologist because I think utility is a far more useful concept in cities than happiness.
That's wonderful, Fran. I've never heard a sociologist.
Thank you very much for nice lectures. My name is Rasmus Van. According to what you said, Peter, there's no difference, or should not be regarded as a difference between rural and urban areas. In Sweden, we already almost half a century ago raised this difference and have the same kind of governance. We don't have cities are not governed in any legally specific terms apart from rural communities. Was this wise, or should we go back to special governance for cities and a kind of special governance for rural areas?
If I just would look into what people would prefer, then we observe worldwide a continuing trend toward bigger cities, because that's where people find more opportunities and maybe more happiness or more utility or whatever we may call it. So the question is then, if people decide to stay in rural areas, perhaps they decide that their happiness is higher or their level of utility is higher, so it's just a free choice. But what you observe worldwide, in any case, is people move to the cities because of more opportunities. It's a famous Harris-Tadaro model, etc., for developing countries, but it also holds for the developed world, in my view. So as long as there is a free choice, we can just observe the outcome and draw inferences out of that outcome. Whether government should play an active role, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure, because people might move out and in. That's a famous Thibaut hypothesis, voting by feet. If you don't like a certain city, you go to another place, you go to another city. So you can move from city A to city B, you can move from city A to rural area B. And it's a free choice, in most of the countries of our world at least.
So I don't have a strong opinion on anything to do with Swedish government, other than the fact that by global standards, it's unbelievably good, right? So the starting point is this is just an extraordinarily well-functioning government by any reasonable standards, which means that sort of any tinkering around the edges feels to me, which this feels like small beer one way or the other. I mean, the stuff works. So maybe if there's a clear problem that you're trying to solve with this, maybe you'd want to solve it. But it just doesn't. I mean, I think Sweden is it's always worthwhile to learn from Sweden, and I've certainly been. My best friend from childhood actually was Swede, and he was the son of a Swedish diplomat in New York, and so I've been learning from Sweden for almost 50 years. But when I think about the developing world, you almost always need more independence and more power at the city level. And so if you take a very clear case, which is the sort of Indian situation, you typically see very empowered state governments. So the central government is relatively weak, the local government is very, very weak. You have state governments which are typically dominated by rural voters who are overrepresented, sometimes historically by a factor of as much as 15 to 1. Right, in terms of the effective amount of voting power they have in the state legislature relative to urbanites. And you have this sort of state legislatures that become dysfunctional as far as getting anything done in terms of, political change in the city. So if we are talking about India, yeah, am I in favor of totally different governance mechanisms for Mumbai, for Kolkata, for Bangalore? Absolutely. I want them to have more independence, and I want them to have probably more executive authority for a central person, because there we see a very clear case of sort of dysfunctional government. And I think by and large, certainly I come from an American perspective where big city mayors are the brightest light of governance within the US relative to our completely dysfunctional national government in so many ways. The local governments often do things that I'm very proud of in terms of the quality of government. So I think that at least in the Indian context, we can see more movements. We should see more movements to local control, but I don't know.
In Massachusetts context, you get a similar thing there where the non-urban.
Sorry, the question was in the Massachusetts context. So the claim was that the reason why Mumbai feels so right to me is there's a famous essay written by George Washington. Well, it's written by a journalist called Reardon. It's describing the words of a New York City politician 100 years ago called George Washington Plunkett. It's full of great stuff like graft is good, and corruption is good, and civil service reform is really bad. And his arguments are fantastic. But one of his lines is New York City is pie for the hayseeds, which basically is talking all about how the upstate legislature, screws over New York and so forth. In Massachusetts, it doesn't feel that extreme. It doesn't feel like, the capital is in Boston. The state is not a huge state. It's dominated very much by its largest metropolitan area. Sure, are there transfers from the city to other areas? Yeah, but it doesn't. And by and large, Massachusetts is a very well-educated state in the union, and it is, as proud as I am of many city governments, I'm relatively proud of my state, but it's not necessarily typical.
Can I make a final remark, Hans? Or very short, yes. My lessons which I've learned from my work for the Asian Development Bank, I think are illuminating. If in a certain continent there is a strong tendency toward urbanization, as a government, don't stop them. Because people will go in any case because they see the highest opportunities. And what you get is illegal squatting, etc. And the social cost and benefits. After you have illegal squatting, where people have put up houses all over, look at South Africa. The cost later on to build a sufficient infrastructure are excessively high, and people pay much more for all kinds of illegal things. So once there is a tendency toward urbanization, support it and make sure you have controlled urbanization. Uncontrolled urbanization is the highest cost we can ever have.
If you turn around, I had raised two very general questions there about what will be the main challenges for policy in the post-urban world. What you don't have to accept the assumption of a post-urban world either, but what will be the main challenges for policy in the future, urban policy then, and what kind of research is needed. Now, you get 3 minutes each to reflect on at least one aspect of this. So.
I think I've basically answered what I think is the main issue, which is in fact making the developing world cities more livable, more humane, improving the delivery of education. In the developed world, we have a couple of issues. So the area where Sweden falls shortest, which is a common issue, is in housing. That housing costs are too high in Stockholm. And thinking through what policy reforms are possible that will permit more housing to be supplied, because there's no way of repealing the laws of supply and demand. If you don't build homes in an area that's attractive, you're going to get a city that's too expensive that becomes a boutique town that's affordable only to the rich. But one that respects the history and beauty of Stockholm. That's a hard challenge, but it's an important one. I will say in terms of the inequality agenda, which is very much both a developing and a developed world problem. The issue is really not, I mean, the problem that I have with the problem with the right is they ignore the problem of poverty and inequality. The problem with the left is they act as if the answers are simple. And they're not simple, right? It's not an issue of taking money for the rich and giving to the poor. That's not a good answer for anything. What we need to do is we actually need to have policies that educate, that empower, that create a whole new, generations of economic, social, cultural energy among those people who start with less. We don't know how to do this. We have ideas, but in fact, we need a constant flow of new research to figure out how to solve these problems, to figure out how to actually make things better, to educate in ways that have meaning. So at least when I think about one of the projects that we designed it, whether or not the politics will ever work, is the idea of having an entrepreneurship district in a higher poverty area in Boston. And part of the idea there was that you would actually have a constant, type of training, both in the schools and out of the schools, to try and teach people more usable skills, teach people how to, go to entrepreneurship boot camp, do a variety of things, starting from the fact that you don't know the right answer. And I think, if you are saddened and troubled by the events of last Friday in Paris, I think you must recognize that we also don't know the answer to the banlieues either, right? It's not that we look at it and we say to ourselves with our august academic majesty, boy, I know how to fix that problem, because I don't know how to fix that problem. But this is exactly where, research, randomized controlled trials, innovative new things in education can really make a meaningful difference. And that's where I am on this.
I've already spoken about inequality, so I'm not going to begin with that as my main challenge for the post-urban world. Let me choose another one, which we've touched on, but we haven't focused on so much, which is the environmental crisis. One of the conditions of a post-urban world, which I wouldn't want to see, is just the suburbanization or the intensification of non-urban space, which maybe some of the returns to the countryside could lead to. So responding to the environmental crisis, and in particular issues of food security and energy security, which are incredibly closely interlinked as we divert more of our agricultural production towards biofuels in order to serve the resource needs of cities. We are producing food crises on the other hand. This is certainly would be a major challenge for a post-urban world.
If I were in charge of urban policy, I would get extremely nervous after the facts highlighted by Ed and Fren, because on all the lists of larger cities in our world, there's hardly any European city to be found. Stockholm isn't there. Only with some luck we might find Paris or so, maybe London, and only Moscow, which is not the best example of a sustainable city in my view. And the rest doesn't exist apparently. Now, if I then take a longer term perspective, the demographic perspective of our world is rather simple. By the year 2050, we will have some 9, maybe 9.5 billion people, so 2.5 billion more than we have nowadays. Most of these people will be in cities, let's say 70%. And that prompts two questions. First, apparently we have to build cities like mad, because we cannot accommodate otherwise all these people. If 70% of the upcoming world population is going into cities, we have to build cities almost every week. Cities the size of Stockholm. Every week we have to build a city the size of Stockholm to accommodate all these people if they move into urban areas, which is, I think, a plausible assumption. I would get extremely nervous on the question how to handle this and how to get a sustainable city. Second, if I were an urban policymaker in Europe, I would even be more nervous, because Europe doesn't exist on the world map anymore. In 2050, with the current population figures, United Nations, etc., OECD, we know that Europe will still have some 500 million people. The world has by then 9.5 billion, so we have 5% of the world population. Europe doesn't count anymore. We are a minority. And perhaps the only way to cope with a minority situation is to have strong cities. But we only have small cities. And then the question is, can our small, tiny European, beautiful cities like Stockholm, can we compete with all the bigger giants in our world. So there is a size at the national or European level. The same holds for North America, by the way, but they have a different city constellation. And can we deal with our smaller cities? How can we handle the competitive power of smaller cities to compete with the whole world, with all these bigger mega cities? I would be extremely nervous.
One potential solution to this problem you mentioned is city networks, but that is another discussion that we will take another time. Now, Pontus Braunerhjelm, my colleague here at KTH, has been brave enough to promise to summarize and give some own thoughts about this seminar. So please, Pontus.
Hans has given me the trivial task to say something about the way forward. And I think something has already been said during the presentation. And it's a bit presumptuous given that Professor Glaser has so many times opened up new paths by posing those questions that you wish that you had thought of yourselves. But anyway, I will give a couple of observations. We have heard about the megatrend of urbanization. And under that, beneath the surface of that concept, there are, of course, a number of the so-called more traditional spatial issues that can be found. They have to do with economies of scales, fixed cost, matching procedures, and knowledge externalities or learning. And I would say that the last one, implying how non-market interactions influence market activities or the real economy, is the most interesting and the one that we perhaps know least about. So I think there is scope for doing more there, and I think a tendency that we can witness when we look at the methodologies applied to urban economics or to economic geography is that the spatial analysis that we observe tend to become smaller and smaller, from metropolitan areas, functional labor markets, counties, municipalities down to cities, and now even more recently blocks. So I don't know where we end up. Perhaps cafes, flats, kitchen table discussions. Who knows? We will see. But I think that we get access to new interesting databases that will open up for much more refined analysis, and also gives us a possibility to pose somewhat different research questions. We have the internet-based data sources, and we have social media and platforms, and we have Google and Google Maps, etc. And that means that we will be able to track communications and knowledge sharing and knowledge transmission in a much more detailed and refined way. And that, I think, will be an interesting track in the future. It may even be the case that we can identify certain individuals which are kind of superstars in communicating, in providing information, and in knowledge sharing. And all these issues are interesting because we believe that knowledge is the engine of growth. So we can track these things, and if we can improve the environment for knowledge sharing, that may also then show up in better performance of the economy, local or regional or national, in terms of enhancing productivity and growth. Then on the other hand, we have digitization and new technologies, and I think that Professor Nijkamp touched upon that. And does it finally mean that physical proximity is not as important as it used to be, and that cyberspace proximity becomes much more important? And I think that relates well to the different types of proximities that were described by Professor Nijkamp. I mean, is it more important if you're a New Yorker to talk to your network, part of your network in other parts of New York, or is it Shanghai or Mumbai that provides the important stimulus to your knowledge or to whatever activity that you are involved in? My own research, if I may touch a little bit upon that, where we look at how individuals move about, it seems as if interregional mobility is more important than mobility within regions in order to positively affect innovations. And that has to do with how homogeneous knowledge may be within a quite contained local geographic entity, or at least that's an hypothesis.